I'm Nick Hernandez, and this is the Positivity Matters podcast. Today, my guest is Professor Emeritus Corey Keyes from Emory University. Dr. Keyes, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me, Nick.
My pleasure. So I have heard of your work for a very long time, so I'm incredibly excited to get a chance to talk with you. And we're looking at human flourishing, well-being, but we're not just looking at well-being. There's also mental illness. Now, in my initial understanding of the human condition, I'd imagine some kind of a ruler going from -10 to +10. And when I came across your work, it really broke that. And instead of going from the positive to the negative, it turned it into a dual axis, XY kind of axis with mental illness along one axis and mental well-being along another. So that really changed my understanding of the human condition. So thank you very much for that. How did you come across that understanding of the psyche?
Well, for me, there were at least two things. And early on in my childhood, and I write about this in the book, in my book that's coming out and called Languishing. This whole journey in studying languishing, which is sort of, it's the absence of good mental health, right? It's not the presence of mental illness. It's that middle child in between mental illness and good mental health. That was a deeply personal experience, and one that I felt a great deal as a teenager after I had been adopted by my grandparents. And and of all things, I loved music, and for me, I remember tuning in every Sunday night to this radio station on the FM radio, and I lived in northern Wisconsin in a very small town, and I would tune into this radio station that came out of Wausau, Wisconsin. And that night was Jackson Browne, and this was shortly after he released his very successful live album called Running on Empty. And I heard that song, and I'd never heard a song in the lyrics that spoke to me so personally. This notion of running on empty, going somewhere and keep moving forward, but you don't really know where things are, and you don't have much in the tank. And that's what I felt as a teenager. And it wasn't, I knew I wasn't sad. It was just that I just felt like every day I would end the day like somebody had gut punched me so hard that I had no air. I felt nothing was there. And it was a very haunting feeling for me. And that song became my anthem. And my best friends in high school will tell you that was the song that I listened to and was my personal anthem. And so later in life, as an adult, I would actually end up with mental illness, depression, and later being diagnosed with PTSD. And I think the reason I became depressed in part was this PTSD that I had developed for the first 12 of my years of my life as a child. Yeah, and so I knew mental illness very personally, and I knew before I became mentally ill, that is depressed, I knew what emptiness was all about. And so knowing that, that guided me, Nick, very, very deeply in how I approached my research. And so to wrap this up, when I started down this road very early into mental health and mental illness, I always believed that they were separate things. But my first instinct is to read all the literature I could, and there was nothing in the psychological or sociological literature. So I looked into philosophy, and I went as far back as I could. I read everything I could, and believe it or not, it was the early Romans and the early Greeks who had actually proposed health and illness belong to separate dimensions or continua. Right? There's the Roman goddess Roman goddess Salus, right? Salutogenic, right? That's a term that some
Mm,
people modern world use. Salus is the presence and absence of good health. And the
mhm,
Greeks, right? The Greeks had this story of the myth of Asclepius. Asclepius is considered the doctor or the father of modern medicine. And Asclepius had two daughters that represented distinct branches of medicine. One was Panacea. Panacea, of course, focused on illness and how to remedy and fix illnesses. And he had another daughter named Hygeia. And Hygeia was all about health and its presence and its absence. So that when I saw those two things, I started to realize, and then I came across, of course, the 1948 definition that the World Health Organization had of health, that health is more than the absence of disease and infirmity. It is the presence of well-being. But then I was really saddened because everyone talked about this, but nobody had studied it. And so I took it upon myself, well, I want to really study whether health and illness belong to separate dimensions. And that's when I started to create my own measure of good mental health, because there was nothing out there before I came along that really measured the presence and absence of good mental health. So that was why I created the measure, because I was very interested in testing this hypothesis of the two continuum model, because to me it had deep implications for how we as a society and as a world should be approaching the problems we were facing, specifically mental illness. So that's sort of how I got started and why I actually had to start first by creating a measure of good mental health.
and around what was the time phase for the development of the metric?
Around, I mean, I began some of this work in 1998, and the first paper that I was actually able to get out in under peer review came out in 2002, and it was the first paper actually that used the terms flourishing and languishing, and and the measurement tool which I called the mental health continuum, from languishing to flourishing. And I chose those words, and sometimes I regret using the word flourishing because everyone's using it and everyone seems to mean something different by it now. But I used it because the word mental health was not well understood. And when you use the word mental health, most people defaulted and assumed you were talking about mental illness. So I wanted to be clear, crystal clear,
Mm.
right? That I was talking about the presence of something good. And if you weren't flourishing, I was talking about the absence of good mental health. And that absence is this condition called languishing.
Now, I believe that sometime during the pandemic, I saw the phrase languishing splashed across the New York Times
Mm.
by an Adam Grant. Is my recollection correct about that? And tell me about that. And
Yes, that's an interesting story, and it's in the acknowledgement of my book. And before I get down the road of that story, it's interesting because I was invited to give a talk at the University of Michigan on my research, and Adam was a graduate student in the Department of Psychology at the time, and so he came to my talk, and I met Adam then, and so that was maybe 20, 25, 20 years ago. and and fast forward then, here Adam was he just published a book called Hidden Potential, and he was working on that book during the pandemic in a particular chapter, and he describes in uh, the problem he was facing, which he came to understand was that he was languishing very badly because he was stuck. Everything was stagnant. He couldn't sit down and concentrate and work on that chapter, and it haunted him. And so what he would do is then get up and sort of play games and other sort of online distractions. And so he wrote this article and described what he thought was the dominant condition that people are experiencing in the middle of the pandemic. This happened to be 2021. And that article Adam wrote, in which he cites me and my work on languishing, became the most read New York Times article that year. And the person who would become my agent read that article, and he himself was struggling with languishing, but had no word for it and no description. He knew he wasn't depressed, but he was sitting there in his apartment in New York, and he sometimes couldn't get out of bed. He felt empty. He felt emotionally numb. And so he went down the rabbit hole of reading my work, and out of the blue contacts me because he read Adam's piece. And fast forward, he said, Corey, you need to write a book about this. The world needs to understand this. And so here we are because of that New York Times article. And Nick, I'll tell you, I never in my wildest dreams thought two things. One, everyone wants to focus on flourishing in positive psychology, and they don't want to start with something like a negative condition called languishing. And I never in my wildest dreams thought it would take a pandemic of everything to lift the awareness globally of the problem of languishing. But that's what it took, because that pandemic took away everything that people took for granted, their connections, their work, their friendships, outside of the house, and you name it. And so they were all running on empty, like I was when I was a teenager. So it's languishing that's really, that along with mental illness, that has always been the reason I took up the mantle of promoting flourishing, and why I thought positive psychology was an important new development. But not everyone in positive psychology agreed with me, not even the people at the first summit. And that in itself may be an interesting story to talk about, but I'll stop there.
Oh, really, I really appreciate the backstory on that, and I am extremely excited to finish up Hidden Potential. I just started it, so
Yes, he has a chapter where he talks about how languishing is a condition that actually hides a lot of human potential. It prevents it from actually being developed. And so it's interesting how this work is actually emerging right now, in multiple ways. It seems to be an important opportunity for us to do something about the problem of languishing, and we can talk more about that if you want.
oh, I believe we should. I would I would say from this pandemic that maybe the advent of this new way of developing vaccines as far as our physical health is just incredibly profoundly awesome. And then on par, maybe even above that, I would say this deeper understanding of languishing and flourishing that's bubbling up, that's coming into the public consciousness. I would say those are the two big positives that I see. And I am going to confess that I myself have gone through extended periods of languishing, and I am deeply appreciative of what you've done and are doing. And I am so excited to see what comes of this. And I'm so excited to be talking with you right now. So,
Thank you, Nick.
yeah. So maybe talk a little bit about the signs of languishing and what are the primary elements in the frameworks that you've developed of what the flourishing is made of. Or
Yeah.
maybe there's something else that we need to talk about first. Feel
Well,
free.
well, you raised the dual continuum model, and you talk about these vaccines, and I write about. There's a whole chapter devoted to all the research I've done that really supports the two continuum model. Vaccines are featured in that chapter because they're a great example of how the body has this dimension of hygeia or salus, which is about strength and weakness. And our immune system is belongs to that dimension of hygeia, or the positive dimension, as I like to refer to it, because vaccines are some remarkable thing that, right, where you introduce just slight, I will call them insults internally to the body that activates the immune system. And if you do it just right, the immune system begins to strengthen with regard to any exposure to the full-blown, shall we say, toxin or virus or germ, right? And so vaccines work off of the positive dimension, or the salutogenic dimension, or the hygienic, whatever you want to call it, dimension that we generally don't focus a lot on. And yet it's a great example of how you build strength, immune strength, by giving the body challenges, and in this case, the immune system challenges that it just manageable challenges. I always talk about they have to be just manageable, and it builds up strength and immunity. Cholesterol, I talk about cholesterol in that chapter, and I've used it in my talks. There's two different kinds of cholesterol, right? Bad, we'll call it the bad kind and the good kind. Well, the good kind is there to help cart off all the problems that get introduced by having a little too much of the high levels of that bad stuff. But here is the problem. Just because, if, right, statins lower levels of bad cholesterol, but that doesn't necessarily produce the best heart health outcomes. What you need is to lower the bad and increase levels of good cholesterol, and you get, generally speaking, and in most people, the best heart health outcomes. So that second dimension, that of good cholesterol, when it's high, protects against the presence of bad cholesterol. But the ideal scenario is where you have low levels of the bad cholesterol and high levels of the good. And that's true with regard to mental health as well, right? The two continuum model consists of the presence, absence of mental illnesses, and a mental illness like depression. You can have low levels of depression, but you could still be languishing. And languishing existentially gets described as feeling blah, which is another way of saying you're emotionally numb. You don't feel much of anything. Nothing's negative, nothing positive. You don't feel much of anything. And people often describe it as being stuck or stagnant. Now, I always like that word stagnant, Nick, because if you look out in nature, everything, and we're part of nature, we were planted here to grow, just like everything else in this world. And when you see a pool of water that's prevented from moving, right? It sits there. It can't move. It can't change and do what it's supposed to do. You start to see all kinds of bad things start to accumulate in that pool of stagnant water. And human beings are just like that. We are meant to grow, to change, and to explore. And that's our version of growing. And when we feel stuck and stagnant, we are just like that pool of water. A film of scum and all kinds of bad things begin to accumulate. And that's what people talk about when they're languishing. But there is, of course, I developed a measurement tool called the mental health continuum. And there's 14 questions, 3 of which reflect feeling good, right? I ask people, did you feel happy, satisfied, or interested in life in the last 2 weeks? And to flourish, you have to have one of those 3 almost every day or every day. And then there's 11 signs of functioning well, 6 of which reflect the 6 dimensions of psychological well-being that Carol Riff um, uh, uh, pioneered in measurement. And I worked with her on those dimensions after she had published her initial paper. Things like, does your life have direction and meaning or purpose? Do you have autonomy, which is, are you able to manage responsibilities of your life? Are you accepting them, or do you like most parts of your personality? Those are 3 of the 6 dimensions. Then there's 5 dimensions of social well-being. Do you feel that you belong to a community? Are you able to are the things that you do contributing worth and value to your community or society? Are you able to make sense of what's going on around you in the world? Those are just 3 of the dimensions. And to flourish, you have to have at least 6 out of the 11 functioning well almost every day. So to flourish is to have 7 out of the 14 almost every day. But it has to be a specific combination of feeling good combined with functioning well. And to languish is to rarely or never, or maybe once in the past week, you felt those things. So you don't really feel a sense of purpose. You don't feel accepting of yourself or other people. You can't make sense of the world around you. You're not contributing anything of worth and value. You don't belong. You don't have warm, trusting relationships. It's to languish is to have the absence of good things. And I call it, languishing is what I would call being mentally unhealthy. And that's very different from I think something like depression, which is to be mentally ill. And the way I describe it is, physically, if you have unhealthy habits, they lead to physical diseases and with time. And what I've shown in my research and others, people's research around the world have shown that if you are mentally unhealthy and languish too long, you slide into and become mentally ill. Languishing is a very strong risk factor for things like depression, anxiety, alcohol and substance abuse and disorders, in other words, addiction, as well as, believe it or not, PTSD, among other problems. So my point in all of this, Nick, is to say that right now, we have nothing that can fix people who have mental illness. Now, I'm using the word fix. We can manage some mental illness with medications, but generally speaking, we don't fix people once they break down. My argument is, if you have anything valuable in your life, why would you let it break if you know that you can't fix it? When you know, it's probably better to prevent it. And that's why languishing is so important. If we could address this slide towards mental illness by addressing people who are mentally unhealthy, that is languishing, and promoting good mental health, that is flourishing, the evidence suggests we could prevent a lot of mental illness, the things we can't fix. And that's my mantra. We need to address languishing because it is a serious problem. And it often leads to other serious problems like mental illness that we can't fix. So we could prevent a lot of these problems if we focused on promoting things that go into flourishing.
Fascinating. I have a quick aside, and then I want to ask about where people should be focusing on flourishing. Should people focus on flourishing at home, at work, out in the community? Where is it applicable, and where might we as communities want to be mindful about flourishing? But first, a quick tangent, and that is, hypothetically, what if a person were, and I'm sorry, I do not I have not studied Dr. Riff's model in depth, and I'm wondering if intellectual curiosity might play into one of the factors that is conducive to flourishing. So, just a quick question there, I guess.
Yes, and in fact, one of the dimensions is called personal growth, and personal growth is the motive and intention to become a better person, better at doing things, and better at being a human being. This in terms of becoming a good person. So personal growth can be translated into becoming good at something and in getting really good at it, or becoming a good person. And I love that dimension because it fits into one of the five things I recommend that people should do if they want to address languishing, which is um, prioritizing learning on a regular basis. Now, that sounds so obvious, but there's, as adults, I suspect we don't prioritize learning because we live in a society that's what we sociologists call age segregated. We put all our learning at the beginning of life in a formal system, and after that, you're supposed to use it, all that knowledge, in your vocation or employment. And we don't usually give people or provide them with means for lifelong learning. And if we do, we prioritize it in retirement, not during your work, your years as an adult working. So, of all things, what we found in research is very clear. People who flourish and stay there are prioritizing learning something new and growing as a person.
Thank you. So now a hypothetical. So what could happen if a person were to put all their chips on intellectual curiosity and maybe not tend to their economic well-being, not tend to their physical health, but just went deeper and deeper into an inquiry into the nature of human flourishing from an intellectual angle, asking for
Well,
a friend.
well, this is exactly what happens to a lot of us who end up, taking the route of more education, and in particular, um, working on advanced degrees. And this is actually when I first ended up seeking help for what would early in my adult life would ultimately be diagnosed for depression. Because before that, I was certain I was languishing, but I was going through the route of deep a deep dive into intellectual pursuits. And getting a PhD can be a very isolating experience because the longer you're at it, the more you have to do independent work. And the last couple of years is where you spend almost all your time alone doing your dissertation research. And your advisor isn't interested in hanging out with you until you have something to show him or her of substance that reflects progress. So it's a very lonely, isolating world where you spend almost all your time if you're doing it right. But a lot of people end up procrastinating. But if you do it right, you're doing exactly what you're talking about. Delving into your intellectual curiosity so deeply that it isolates you, and it may be a much more, and it becomes an unhealthy period in your life for many of us. We end up not only spending time languishing, we end up sliding into things like depression. And that's what happened exactly to me.
Myself as well, but I never had a clinical diagnosis.
Yeah.
I've added movement into my life over the past 5 years, And I've found myself in a profession that, as my well-being grows, is becoming more and more fascinating to me. So uh,
Hmm.
thank you for sharing on that as well. Okay, now where in society, I think I've heard the concept, we always think of like work, home, and maybe a third place. Like for many people, that's religious communities, but sometimes that doesn't work for everybody. So this idea of third place outside of work and home,
Yeah.
where should people be mindful of promoting flourishing? And like, I'm trying to picture, how does the conversation happen in your third place, at home at the dinner table and at work with your boss about human flourishing?
Well, we could make this relevant to a lot of workplaces because the other problem, I could list up to 14 problems that I talk about in my book with what languishing brings, and not the least of which is missed days of work, what we call lost days of work, and then presenteeism, where people who are languishing are much less productive. Um, People are languishing, um, engage, visit, seek out medical help for mental and emotional reasons as well as physical reasons as much, if not more, than people with depression. So it's a very costly condition, among other things. So there's a variety of reasons that people in this who are running workplaces and managing them would want to take care of this. But same with people who are in this school system, because kids who are languishing are much more likely to engage in a variety of delinquent behaviors. And even in middle school age children, languishing kids are already starting to smoke, experiment with inhalants, drink alcohol, skip school. And this is in middle school. And then it gets much worse in high school. I could go on. So I'm not going to, in my book, I don't talk about places where we should prioritize flourishing because, not to sound, this may sound a little jaded, but I don't, I think in my book, I'm trying to speak to the individual to take his or her good mental health and its absence as serious, and not wait for social institutions to catch up with them. My hope is schools and workplaces and communities will get the message. But here is what I recommend people do. And there's 5 activities. And I call them the 5 vitamins for flourishing, or the 5 vitamins to address flourishing deficiency, if you will. This is based on a study that I reviewed for publication, and I just fell in love with it. The title of it is called a Tuesday in the Life of Flourishers. And this was a graduate dissertation originally, and it was a longitudinal study. And every Tuesday, this researcher would call up her subjects. These were adults in community dwelling adults. And every Tuesday, she would have them reconstruct the prior day, so their Monday. And she asked them of how they felt in a variety of ways. Did they feel content, joyful, proud, grateful, and a variety of other positive things? And the more you had of those things, let's just call it, you had a better day. And then she asked them whether they had done any of the following 6 things. Had they played? Did they engage in a spiritual or religious activity? Did they socialize or connect in person with others? Did they learn something new? And what was the I must lose my space here. And did they help somebody or work on helping improve something? So did you help? Did you learn? Did you engage in spirituality or religion? And so forth, right? Those five things. And what she found was, oh, and let me step back. Then she measured depression and as well as whether they were flourishing or languishing. So there are three groups of people: those who met the criteria for depression. Then there were people who weren't depressed, and they were either flourishing or languishing. And here's the good news: it didn't matter whether you were depressed, languishing, or flourishing, of course, but if you did more of those activities, there were five of them. The sixth one was exercise, and exercise, doing more of that on Monday did not result in a better day. But the other five, if you did more of those that on the day prior to her calling up, you had a much better day, whether you were depressed, languishing, or flourishing. And over time, if you were depressed or languishing, if you kept doing those five things, learning something new, spirituality / religion, and so forth, helping somebody, so forth, right? You moved towards flourishing, away from depression and away from languishing. So those five things, the second half of my book are devoted to digging deeper into all of those things: play when you're adult, spirituality, or what I call transcendence, and helping others or / finding your purpose, learning something new or growing and becoming a better human being, and connecting and socializing, and those are the five vitamins. And you can do that anywhere, and you don't have to pay anybody to do it. And I think workplaces would be wise, actually, to help employees prioritize those five vitamins. I think schools would be very wise, whether it's K through 12 or college, to prioritize those five activities. And I think families could go a long way towards prioritizing those five things, not only doing them themselves, but doing them perhaps as a family.
I can see that.
Yeah.
I want to be a bit of a devil's advocate for a moment, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
How about the hard determinist atheist who asks, what do you mean by spirituality or religion? And can such a person find sources of flourishing in that dimension if they have that type of a worldview?
Yeah.
Or do they just have to rely on pushing hard on the other four?
Well, I would hope in that chapter, I'm very aware, and I start out the chapter recognizing. So, and I'll just read you the first paragraph, the first two paragraphs, because I'm very aware that some people will hear this spirituality religion thing and say, "Oh, that's not for me."
Please do.
Okay. Yeah. So, quote, and that name of that chapter is "Move Closer to the Infinite." In other words, the point of the chapter is trying to encourage people to see that in these practices, you don't have to be a religious or a spiritual person to benefit from developing along lines of excellence, like to understand the mysteries of the universe, if you will, to develop things in yourself like acceptance and kindness and forgiveness and a variety of other things that will benefit you. So here's the first two paragraphs. Our next flourishing vitamin involves practicing religion or spirituality. Quote, "Oh boy," you might be saying to yourself, "I'm not religious and I don't care to be." Or, quote, "I'm not spiritual and I couldn't care less about such things." Okay, I understand that. And you shouldn't commit to anyone else's belief system if it doesn't serve you. Kind attention, acceptance, and reverence for mystery are three ideals I chase. All of them guide me as well as can guide you towards becoming more comfortable with being small by understanding that we are part of something much bigger than we realize. We need to practice. We need practices that root us in these ideals, that help us constantly come back to them and recenter ourselves in them, whether we label them as spiritual or not. And we must also learn that the right vocabulary to understand our place is right here. We're part of a much larger story. We're part of a universe that is mysterious, so mysterious that even the greatest thinkers, Stephen Hawking and Albert Einstein, couldn't fathom its innermost workings. And they went on to embrace things we might call spirituality and religion. So it was a hard chapter to write because in retrospect, I wish I had spent some time in that chapter talking about the way the ancient world viewed philosophy and the way it can be used even to this day. So if you're not a religious person, philosophy serves the same function of guiding you towards and recommending ways to respond, shall we say, in terms of your better angels in this life. It guides you, if you will, ethically and morally. Now, a lot of philosophy, if you look at Aristotle and even Epicurus, is rooted in helping guide us and tell us what is the good or the better way to respond and live. So if you're not religious or spiritual, you can take on a philosophy. Right now, my father-in-law, who's 89, has been reading and studying Stoicism, a wonderful philosophy that is rooted in ethics and is very relevant to this day, and helps a lot of people, including my father-in-law, guides his behavior and his thinking as he approaches the end of life and the challenges that come with the end of life, not the least of which is our own mortality, which scares the hell out of a lot of people. So if you're not religious, there's always philosophy, is what I say.
Much appreciated. Thank you so much. I'm sure some listeners may be asking those kinds of questions. Okay. I have another hypothetical for you. So I've heard of various practices in terms of knitting people together through gratitude. One of the practices I've heard is called appreciative inquiry. Another for knitting community is called asset-based community development. And I am very much for grassroots approaches to approaching an elevation of psychological well-being, but I am not opposed to top-down approaches either. And I was trying to envision a top-down approach. And if we start as at a focal point of let's say an extremely well-endowed private foundation that on its investment side says to the companies that it's invested in as shareholders, corporations A through Z, we want you to be talking about and promoting flourishing, addressing languishing in all of your workplaces. We as investors are putting that forward. And then in terms of their own staff at a foundation, and in terms of the nonprofit organizations that they fund, to take a similar approach, and to the degree possible with their collaboration amongst other institutional investors, corporate, governmental, to develop coalitions around this idea as well. And I know there's a lot a lot of other kinds of reducing harm and environmental impact that they can also focus on.
Yeah.
But I'm just envisioning a world where there's some kind of coalition that promotes it from the top down, as well as all these other methodologies that could be used to promote it from the bottom up. One of my strengths, thank you, Don Clifton, for developing the Strengths Finder, is connectedness. And I'm just going to take a brief moment to say I went through life prior to taking his Strengths Finder, viewing myself and others primarily through the lens of weakness, and I did not have a mental construct, a vocabulary by which to conceive of myself and others in terms of strengths. And it was one of the most profound days of my life. And it was in the workplace when they had us talk about strengths. And the activity that they did was to have us each read this book, take the survey, and bring our top 5 strengths to the to the conference room at work.
Mm.
And the exercise was for, as it went around the room, for each person that the focus was on, our coworkers talked about how they saw our strengths coming out. And it was just the most elevating experience that I'd ever had in the workplace. So and I had no idea what positive psychology was. I said to myself, what the hell just happened? What was that? That was incredibly uplifting. What is this?
Yeah.
And it was shortly thereafter, when I started looking into it, that I heard of this thing called positive psychology. And this was in 2006 when this happened at the workplace. And just so happened to be situated here in Lincoln, Nebraska, where this focus on strengths is in the air. One thing led to another, and here we are today talking about promoting human flourishing and reducing languishing. So, okay, that's my aside. Back to you. What kind of conversations have you had around flourishing with, I don't know, what are the conversations that you found most interesting? Leaders, person on the street, other academics. Where does this seem to be resonating?
Actually, by design, I've been a bit of a hermit, so I've kind of been out of circulation for a while, and not just because of the pandemic, Nick. I retired from academia early, and so it was January of 2023. Where I became professor emeritus, and the reason was and I was writing this book. So those two things combined, I stepped out and away from sort of the intellectual world so that I could write this story. This is what I had been working for and working towards. My career was to build up what I considered a sufficiently strong scientific base before I wrote a book that recommended do anything. And I did not particularly want or like the fact that a lot of people in positive psychology, long before there was much research behind it, were writing books and recommending people do things based on it. And some of those things felt flat. And I think for good reason. I don't think people were patient enough. And I think you all know that we all know the story of the hare and the turtle. I chose the path of the turtle, and some of that has been, I've stepped away so that I could just do the research and slowly build up the case we're moving in this direction. And so, and then the opportunity arose for the reason we talked about earlier in our conversation on the pandemic and the New York Times piece on languishing, to write this book. And so I'm about ready to get back into circulation and become much more of an activist. I think I've always had the passion to try to change the way we approach mental health care. I think we're going about it backwards, completely backwards. I don't see the point of waiting for people to break down when you have nothing that you can offer to fix something that valuable. Or, as I used to say, why are we waiting for people to fall off a cliff and all we're doing is parking more ambulances at the bottom of a cliff? Because we can prevent a lot of the things that we can't fix, like depression and anxiety, and we can get what we say we want, mental health, if right when we try to prevent this. So I want to start challenging everyone, and of all people, not just places like the National Institute of Mental Health Care, but businesses, schools, even the World Health Organization. I think is all we do is get these reports about mental illness, and I open up articles and hear newscasts. Well, there's this crisis of teen mental illness. Nothing changes, Nick. Nothing. I don't think it's enough to talk about it, and I think this book is talking about a new way of preventing a lot of that by getting what you want, promoting flourishing. And so, with the launch of this book next month in February, it comes out in February 20th of this year. My hope, and I will not stop, is to advocate for a better, more sane way to deal with mental health in this world. And rather than waiting for people to break down, we could be responding much sooner to the earliest losses of flourishing. When people begin to languish, we need to address it then, right then.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. Yeah. And the problem is that I think in part is some of the people who even believe in this positive approach are part of the problem, because if you look at the World Happiness Report, all they measure is the feeling good stuff. Feeling good is barely 3 out of the 14 questions that make up mental health. Now, I even have data, and I write about it in the book, that there's a lot of people who would meet the criteria for flourishing if you ask them just did they feel happy, satisfied with life. A lot of people feel that every day, almost every day, but they're not functioning well. Their life doesn't have purpose. They don't have a sense of belonging. They're not making a contribution to the world. They're not growing, becoming better human beings, or being challenged to it. They don't like themselves. They don't like other people. They can't make sense of the world. Yet they feel good. Compared to people who are flourishing, who put those two things together, the people who just feel good have over 3 times the rate of depression. And you're probably wondering, how can somebody say they're happy every day or almost every day and yet meet the criteria for depression? And the answer is simple. If you're not functioning well, you can find a way to feel good on things that have no substance. It's kind of like our diet. Eating Cheetos every day tastes great, makes you feel good, but it has no vitamins, no nutrition. Our life is like that. You can feel good about all kinds of bad things or ugly, or even things that have little substance. I don't think feeling good is simply enough. And I write about all kinds of things in the book that show that this focus on positive emotions is simply not enough. So there's a lot of people who need to get the message that it's not feeling good alone that's important. It's feeling good where you're functioning with purpose, belonging, contribution, acceptance, and growth. And we need to get that message into the people, the people who are even considered champions of this approach, because they keep writing that talk about the happiest countries in this world. Happiness isn't, as I say in this book, it isn't your North Star to flourishing. Because a lot of people who feel happy aren't going to be motivated to try to function better. So there's a lot of people I intend to try to get the message out. It's about feeling good when you function well or as a result of functioning well. And that combination is the sweet spot for preventing the things we can't fix, like depression and anxiety and other problems.
It sounds like the stakes are real, and I can't be more excited with the launch of this book. And I am just so appreciative that you were willing to be a guest on the Positivity Matters podcast of all things. And I think when I started this project, it's a community project, grassroots, and that was just where I was at. I think I just wanted to feel better when I started it, and I think I can still affirm that positivity matters, but there's a lot more to the story of human flourishing, and I think you've drawn the map, from what it sounds like here. So this is awesome.
Okay. Well, keep up
Thank
the
you.
good work, Nick, because the grassroots approach is really important. I I do believe that lots of people are hungry for these things, and they're hungry for a life in which feeling good and getting jolts of dopamine is simply not enough. They want a life where they can make some kind of contribution, belong and accept and understand and grow just as much as any of us. So keep it up.
Thank you so much. Last question, I suppose, here, and that is, have you found a new song?
I now know there's a modern equivalent to mine, my song for Running on Empty, but I don't think that's what you're asking, because there was as I was writing this book, there was a song called Numb Little Bug that is exactly the same version of Running on Empty that I heard so many years ago. But the songs, I would not say that I have found a more positive song. I write about in my book my own journey, which informed a lot of my research, from being abandoned as a baby to being adopted, and all the other problems that really, really, really motivated my search for something better. And so I'm still working on that song, Nick. Still working on it. I don't think I'll ever be done.
The never-ending story, and
Yeah.
and I think there's a song that just goes on and on too. The
I
song that
think,
never ends. The
yeah,
song that never ends. Maybe that's the one.
the song, and yeah, and I think each of our lives, I've shifted from songs to seeing everyone's life as a potential gift. And then my job, and I think the job, as if I had a chance to reframe positive psychology, is to encourage and help other people unlock the gift that is their life. And that's it. Because every one of us have a gift, but we're not so sure the world wants it, and that's not important. We've got to give the gift that we were put here to give.
I don't think there's a better way to end the podcast than that. Thank you very much, Dr. Keys.
Thank you for having me, Nick, and take care.